The October wind cut through the streets of Lincoln Park like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Margaret Maggie Caldwell pulled her wool coat tighter as she stepped out of Lincoln Elementary School, her leather satchel heavy with the weight of 28 second-grade spelling tests that needed grading before tomorrow. The year was 1988, and at 34, she had been teaching for over a decade, her passion for education as unwavering as the Chicago skyline that stretched endlessly beyond the school's windows. The fluorescent lights of the school hallway flickered behind her as she pushed through the heavy glass doors, her breath immediately visible in the crisp air. It was 4:47 p.m., according to the Timex watch her father had given her for graduation, a watch that still kept perfect time after all these years. Maggie had stayed late again, helping Tommy Rodriguez with his reading and organizing materials for tomorrow's Halloween party. The children had been buzzing with excitement all week, their costumes already planned, their young faces glowing with anticipation. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more mysterious cases like this one, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you these compelling true stories from across America. Maggie's routine was as predictable as the L train schedule. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she walked the same route home to her apartment on North Halsted Street, a cozy one-bedroom place she'd rented since moving to Chicago from Rockford 5 years earlier. The walk took exactly 18 minutes, past Murphy's Deli, where old Mr. Murphy always waved from behind the counter, past the small park where she sometimes stopped to feed the pigeons, and finally up the 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B, where her cat, Hemingway, would be waiting by the door. But this particular Thursday evening felt different somehow. The street seemed quieter than usual, the shadows longer and more menacing. Maggie attributed it to the changing season and the recent news reports about increased crime in the area. Chicago in the late 80s was grappling with rising violence, and even neighborhoods like Lincoln Park weren't immune to the city's growing pains. As she walked past Murphy's Deli, she noticed the closed sign hanging crooked in the window. Strange. Murphy's was always open until 6 on weekdays. She paused for a moment, peering through the glass, but the interior was dark and empty. Shrugging, she continued her journey, the click of her low heels echoing against the concrete sidewalk. The park was deserted except for a lone figure sitting on a bench near the playground. Maggie squinted in the dim light, trying to make out details, but the person was too far away and partially hidden by shadows. Something about the scene unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Perhaps it was the way the figure sat so perfectly still, or the fact that no one usually lingered in the park after dark, especially not in October, when the temperature dropped so dramatically after sunset. She quickened her pace slightly, her keys already in her hand, a habit her brother David had taught her during one of his visits from the police academy. "Always have your keys ready, Maggie," he'd said. "Don't fumble around at your door like a sitting duck." David worried about her living alone in the city, constantly sending newspaper clippings about safety tips and self-defense classes. Their parents in Rockford shared his concerns, frequently calling to check on her and suggesting she move back home where it was safer. But Maggie loved Chicago with a fierce devotion that surprised even herself. She loved the energy of the city, the diversity of her students, the way the lake looked different every morning from her classroom window. She loved the museums and the restaurants, the street musicians and the bustling crowds. This was where she belonged, where she was making a difference in young lives, where she felt most like herself. As she turned onto North Halsted Street, Maggie noticed a dark sedan parked with its engine running. The exhaust created small clouds in the cold air, and she could see the silhouette of someone behind the wheel. Again, something felt off, though she told herself she was being paranoid. Cars idled on city streets all the time, people waiting for friends, making phone calls, or simply taking a moment to collect themselves after a long day. She was only 2 blocks from home now, passing the familiar storefronts that had become landmarks in her daily routine. Chen's laundromat, with its perpetually steamed windows, the small bookstore where she sometimes browsed on Saturday afternoons, and the corner market where she bought milk and bread when she couldn't make it to the larger grocery store. The streetlights had come on, casting pools of amber light every 30 feet or so, but between them lay pockets of darkness that seemed deeper than usual. Maggie found herself walking faster, her breath coming in short puffs, her satchel bouncing against her hip with each step. She was being ridiculous, she told herself. This was her neighborhood, her safe space, the route she'd walked hundreds of times without incident. Behind her, she heard the soft purr of an engine moving slowly, matching her pace. When she glanced over her shoulder, she saw the same dark sedan creeping along the street, its headlights off despite the growing darkness. Her heart began to race, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. Something was very wrong. Maggie's apartment building was now just half a block away, its red brick facade as familiar and welcoming as an old friend. She could see the warm glow of lights in various windows, the comforting signs of her neighbors going about their evening routines. Mrs. Patterson in 2A would be watching her game shows, while the young couple in 1C would be cooking dinner, their kitchen window always steamed from whatever elaborate meal they were preparing. She reached into her purse for her keys, her fingers trembling slightly as they closed around the metal ring. The sedan had stopped at the corner, its engine still running, and she could feel eyes watching her from within its dark interior. Every instinct told her to run, to sprint the remaining distance to her building, but her legs felt heavy and uncooperative, as if she were moving through thick mud. The last thing Margaret Caldwell remembered was the sound of footsteps behind her, quick and purposeful, closing the distance between them with alarming speed. She tried to turn around, tried to call out, but the October night seemed to swallow her voice before it could escape her lips. Her keys fell to the sidewalk with a sharp metallic clatter that echoed through the empty street. And then there was only darkness. When Maggie failed to show up for school the next morning, Principal Robert Hayes initially assumed she was sick. It wasn't like her to miss work without calling, but even the most reliable teachers occasionally fell ill. However, when attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered throughout the morning, concern began to creep in. Maggie was known for her punctuality and responsibility. In 10 years of teaching, she had never missed a day without prior notice. By noon, Hayes had contacted the police, though Officer Janet Walsh, who took the initial report, seemed less than concerned. Adults went missing for various reasons, she explained patiently, and 24 hours hadn't even passed yet. Maybe Miss Caldwell had a family emergency, or perhaps she'd decided to take an impromptu trip. The officer's tone suggested this was routine, that worried employers called in missing person reports all the time, and that most of these cases resolved themselves within a day or two. But Hayes knew Maggie better than that. He'd hired her fresh out of college, had watched her develop into one of Lincoln Elementary's most beloved teachers. She was the type of person who planned her lessons weeks in advance, who never forgot a student's birthday, who stayed late to help struggling readers. She wouldn't simply disappear without explanation, leaving her second graders wondering where their teacher had gone, especially not the day before the Halloween party she'd been planning for weeks. The search for Maggie Caldwell began in earnest on Friday morning, when she'd been missing for over 36 hours. Her brother David drove down from Milwaukee, his police training kicking in as he coordinated with the Chicago PD. He was the one who discovered her keys on the sidewalk outside her apartment building, glinting in the morning sun like a breadcrumb trail that led nowhere. The keys told a story that made David's blood run cold. They were scattered across several feet of concrete, as if they'd been dropped during a struggle or thrown in haste. Her leather satchel was nowhere to be found, nor was there any sign of Maggie herself. The superintendent of her building, a gruff man named Pete Kowalski, reported that her cat had been crying incessantly since Thursday night and that her mail was piling up in the lobby. Detective Raymond Burke, a 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, was assigned to the case. He was a methodical man with steel-gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of the city's dark side. Burke interviewed everyone who might have seen Maggie on Thursday evening. The students who'd stayed after school, the other teachers, the crossing guard who worked the intersection near Lincoln Elementary. The last confirmed sighting came from Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, an elderly woman who lived 3 blocks from the school. She remembered seeing Maggie walking past her house around 5:15 p.m., looking hurried and clutching her coat against the wind. Mrs. Vasquez had been watering her plants by the window and had waved, though she wasn't sure if Maggie had seen her. After that, it was as if Margaret Caldwell had simply vanished into the Chicago night. The investigation revealed few concrete leads. Several residents reported seeing a dark sedan in the neighborhood that evening, but descriptions were vague and conflicting. One witness thought it was blue, another black, and a third insisted it was dark green. The license plate number remained a mystery, and no one could definitively say they'd seen Maggie interact with the vehicle or its occupants. Security cameras were not as prevalent in 1988 as they would become in later years, and the few businesses that had them either hadn't captured anything useful or had already recorded over the footage from that Thursday night. Burke followed every possible lead with the determination of a man who'd made too many promises to too many families over the years. He checked with Maggie's family in Rockford, her colleagues at the school, even her college friends who were scattered across the Midwest. Everyone painted the same picture: a dedicated teacher, a loving daughter and sister, a woman with no enemies and no reason to disappear voluntarily. The media picked up the story within a week, though it never reached the level of national attention. Local news stations ran segments about the missing teacher, showing her school photo, a professional headshot that captured her warm smile and intelligent eyes, alongside footage of the street where she'd last been seen. The Chicago Tribune ran a small article on page 3, asking anyone with information to contact the police. Tips poured in, but led nowhere. Several people claimed to have seen Maggie at various locations around the city, getting on a bus downtown, shopping at a grocery store in Wicker Park, sitting in a coffee shop in Hyde Park. But when investigators followed up, these sightings invariably proved to be cases of mistaken identity. Other callers reported suspicious activities or vehicles, but none provided the breakthrough that Burke desperately needed. As weeks turned into months, the active investigation began to wind down. Burke kept the case file on his desk, continuing to follow up on any new leads that came in, but the trail had grown cold. Maggie's family offered a reward for information leading to her safe return, and missing person flyers with her photograph appeared on telephone poles and shop windows throughout Lincoln Park, but slowly, inevitably, they began to fade and disappear, replaced by newer tragedies and more recent appeals for help. By Christmas of 1988, it was as if Margaret Caldwell had never existed. Her apartment was eventually cleared out by her family, her personal belongings boxed up and stored in her parents' basement in Rockford. The school hired a replacement teacher, and life at Lincoln Elementary gradually returned to normal, though those who had known Maggie well carried the weight of her absence like a stone in their hearts. The years passed with cruel indifference. Detective Burke retired in 1995, passing Maggie's case file to his replacement, along with dozens of others that had never been solved. David Caldwell continued to call the Chicago Police Department every few months, asking if there had been any developments, any new leads, any reason for hope. The answer was always the same. The case remained open, but there was nothing new to report. Maggie's parents aged visibly in the years following their daughter's disappearance, their grief manifesting in different ways. Her father threw himself into work, taking on extra shifts at the factory, as if physical exhaustion could somehow dull the pain of not knowing. Her mother joined a support group for families of missing persons, finding solace in the company of others who understood the unique torture of loving someone who had simply vanished without a trace. The world changed around Maggie's absence. The Cold War ended, technology advanced, and Chicago continued to evolve and grow. The neighborhood where she'd lived was gradually gentrified, with trendy restaurants and boutique shops replacing some of the older establishments she'd known. Murphy's Deli closed in 1993, and the small park where she'd sometimes fed pigeons was renovated with new playground equipment and better lighting. But in one corner of an evidence locker in a Chicago Police Department storage facility, a cardboard box labeled Caldwell, Margaret, Missing Person Case, May 8, 20247, sat gathering dust alongside thousands of other unsolved cases. Inside were her keys, still bearing traces of the October night when they'd been scattered across the sidewalk, along with witness statements, photographs of the search area, and a school photo that no longer quite captured the vibrant woman who had once walked those streets with purpose and hope. It wasn't until the spring of 2001 that Margaret Caldwell's name would be spoken again in connection with an active investigation, 13 years after she'd disappeared into the Chicago night. The discovery would come from an unexpected source and would reignite not only the official investigation into her disappearance, but also the hopes of a family who would never stop believing that someday, somehow, they would learn the truth about what had happened to the teacher who had simply wanted to make it home safely on a cold October evening. The renovation of the old Riverside Community Center began on an unseasonably warm March morning in 2001. The building, which had sat abandoned for nearly 5 years, was slated for conversion into affordable housing units, a project that had taken months of city planning and community meetings to approve. The structure itself dated back to the 1940s, a solid brick building that had served various purposes over the decades, first as a community gathering place, then as a youth center, and finally as a makeshift shelter for the homeless before being condemned in 1996 due to structural concerns and code violations. Construction foreman Tony Martinez had been in the business long enough to know that old buildings held secrets. As his crew began tearing down interior walls and removing decades of accumulated debris, they'd already uncovered several interesting artifacts: old newspapers from the 50s, photographs that had apparently fallen behind radiators, even a collection of love letters tied with a faded ribbon that someone had hidden in a wall cavity sometime in the 1960s. But it was 17-year-old Jessica Park, working her first construction job as part of a vocational training program, who made the discovery that would change everything. She was clearing out a small storage room in the basement when her crowbar caught on something wedged between 2 floor joists. At first, she thought it was just another piece of debris. The basement was full of old wood scraps, rusted tools, and forgotten materials from decades of repairs and renovations. "Tony!" she called out, her voice echoing in the concrete space. "There's something stuck down here, and I can't get it loose." Martinez made his way down the narrow basement stairs, his work boots heavy on the worn wooden steps. The basement smelled of mildew and age, with small pools of standing water in the corners where the building's foundation had developed minor leaks over the years. A few bare bulbs provided minimal lighting, creating a maze of shadows between the support columns and stored materials. Jessica was kneeling beside an exposed section of flooring, her crowbar inserted into a gap between 2 joists. "It feels like leather or something," she explained, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her gloved hand. "But it's really wedged in there tight." Martinez knelt beside her and examined the situation. Sure enough, there was something dark and substantial caught in the narrow space. Using his own crowbar and a small flashlight, He worked carefully to extract whatever had been hidden there, mindful that it might be something historically significant, given the building's age. What emerged was a leather satchel, badly water-damaged and covered in dust, but still intact enough to reveal its original brown color and professional design. The brass clasps were tarnished green, and the leather was cracked and stiff, but the bag itself remained structurally sound. It was clearly old. The style and craftsmanship suggested something from the 1980s or early 1990s. "Should we open it?" Jessica asked, her curiosity evident in her voice. Martinez hesitated. His years in construction had taught him to be cautious about items found in old buildings. Sometimes they contained asbestos or other hazardous materials, and sometimes they held personal belongings that should be returned to their rightful owners. But more often than not, they were simply forgotten relics with no particular significance. "Let's take it upstairs, where we can see better," he decided, carefully lifting the satchel from its hiding place. In the bright, fluorescent lights of the main floor, the satchel revealed more of its secrets. Despite the water damage and years of neglect, they could make out initials embossed on the front flap, MC. The brass nameplate that had once been attached to the handle was missing, leaving only small holes where screws had once held it in place. Martinez opened the clasps carefully, aware that the old leather might crack or tear if handled too roughly. Inside, protected somewhat by the satchel's design, were the remnants of what had once been a teacher's daily materials. Water damage had destroyed much of the paper, but they could still make out fragments of worksheets, the corner of what looked like a gradebook, and several items that had survived the years in better condition. Among these was a small address book with a dark blue cover, its pages yellowed but still readable. The entries were written in neat, feminine handwriting, phone numbers and addresses for people with names like Mom and Dad, David, Work, and Principal Hayes. There was also a small photo, cracked and faded, but still identifiable as a class picture of young children, the kind that teachers often kept as mementos of their students. But it was the notebook that would prove most significant. Bound in black composition book covers and filled with lined paper, it had survived the years in remarkably good condition, protected by its position within the inner pocket of the satchel. The cover bore a white label with Margaret Caldwell, personal notes, written in the same careful handwriting they'd seen in the address book. Jessica, who had been watching over Martinez's shoulder as he examined the contents, suddenly grabbed his arm. "Tony, look at this," she whispered, pointing to a newspaper clipping that had been tucked between the pages of the address book. Though water-damaged and barely legible, they could still make out portions of the headline. "Local teacher. Missing. Police seek." Martinez felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool March air. He'd lived in Chicago his entire life, and like most longtime residents, he remembered cases of missing persons that had captured public attention over the years. The name Margaret Caldwell seemed familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. "We need to call the police," he said quietly, though he continued to examine the notebook that Jessica had opened to reveal pages of handwritten entries. Even from their brief glance, it was clear that this wasn't just a teacher's planning book or record of daily activities. The entries seemed more personal, more urgent somehow, as if the person who had written them had been documenting something important or troubling. Officer Lisa Chen arrived at the community center within 30 minutes of Martinez's call. She was a 12-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, currently assigned to the district that covered the area where the building was located. Chen had experience with found property cases, though most involved wallets or purses that had been lost and recovered, not mysterious satchels discovered in abandoned buildings. Her initial examination of the contents confirmed what Martinez and Jessica had suspected. This appeared to be connected to an old missing person case. The name Margaret Caldwell combined with the teacher materials and the newspaper clipping, suggested they had stumbled upon evidence related to a disappearance that had occurred years earlier. Chen carefully photographed everything in place before removing the items from the satchel. The notebook, in particular, drew her attention. Unlike the other materials, which were clearly work-related, this seemed to contain personal observations and concerns. Even her brief scanning of a few pages revealed entries that spoke of feeling watched, of strange occurrences, and of growing fear about her safety. Back at the station, Chen ran the name Margaret Caldwell through the department's missing person database. What she found made her immediately understand the significance of Jessica Park's discovery. Margaret Caldwell, age 34, had been reported missing on October 28, 1988. She was a teacher at Lincoln Elementary School who had disappeared while walking home from work. The case had remained unsolved for over 12 years, with no significant leads or developments since the initial investigation. The case file made for sobering reading. Detective Raymond Burke, who had been the lead investigator, had been thorough in his work, interviewing dozens of people and following every possible lead. But without physical evidence or credible witnesses, the trail had quickly gone cold. Maggie had simply vanished, leaving behind a family that refused to give up hope and a community that had never forgotten their missing teacher. Chen immediately contacted Detective Michael Torres, who had inherited several of Burke's old cases when the veteran investigator retired. Torres was a methodical man in his 40s, with a reputation for being particularly dedicated to cold cases. When Chen explained what had been discovered at the community center, he dropped everything and drove over to examine the evidence personally. The notebook would prove to be a revelation. As Torres read through Margaret Caldwell's final entries, a picture emerged of a woman who had been increasingly concerned about her safety in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The entries weren't daily. Sometimes a week or more would pass between them, but they painted a troubling portrait of someone who had begun to feel hunted. The earliest entry in the notebook was dated September 15th, 1988, just over a month before Maggie disappeared. It was brief and matter-of-fact. Thought I saw the same car yesterday and today on my walk home. Dark sedan. Couldn't see the driver clearly. Probably nothing. But David always says to trust your instincts. Subsequent entries revealed a pattern of escalating concern. September 22nd. The car was there again today, parked on Halsted Street. When I looked back after passing it, the driver seemed to be watching me. I'm probably being paranoid, but I've started varying my route home. October 3rd. Mrs. Murphy from the deli asked if I was feeling all right. She said I looked pale and worried. I didn't tell her about the car or the phone calls. Phone calls. Torres made a note to follow up on this detail. The original investigation hadn't mentioned any suspicious phone calls, which meant either they hadn't occurred to the investigators to ask about them, or Maggie hadn't reported them to anyone at the time. October 10th. The calls are getting more frequent. Always late at night, always the same pattern. The phone rings 3 times, then stops. When I answer, there's just breathing on the other end. Then they hang up. I've stopped answering the phone after 9 p.m. October 18th. I think someone was in my apartment. Nothing was taken, but things were moved slightly. My jewelry box was open when I know I closed it this morning. The lock on my door wasn't damaged, so either I'm losing my mind or someone has a key. I've asked Mr. Kowalski to change the locks, but he says he needs approval from the property management company. The final entry was dated October 25th, just 3 days before Maggie disappeared. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched constantly now. At school, walking home, even in my own apartment. I've thought about going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I have a feeling that someone might be following me. David would want me to report it, but I keep thinking it will sound foolish. Maybe I'm just stressed from work and letting my imagination run wild. But tonight, I'm going to start keeping this notebook with me. If something does happen, at least there will be a record of what led up to it." Torres set the notebook down and rubbed his eyes. Here was evidence that Margaret Caldwell had been systematically stalked in the weeks before her disappearance, evidence that could have been crucial to the original investigation if it had been available at the time. The fact that she had been carrying the notebook with her when she disappeared, and that it had somehow ended up in an abandoned building, suggested that whoever had taken her had also taken her belongings. But how had the satchel ended up wedged between floor joists in the basement of the Riverside Community Center? The building was located nearly 2 miles from where Maggie had last been seen, in a different neighborhood entirely. Torres made a note to research the building's history and determine who might have had access to it in 1988. The discovery of Margaret Caldwell's notebook would prove to be the breakthrough that investigators had been waiting for 13 years to find. But it also raised more questions than it answered, and as Detective Torres began to follow the new leads that emerged from Maggie's own words, he would discover that her disappearance was far more complex and sinister than anyone had originally imagined. The reinvestigation of Margaret Caldwell's disappearance began with a phone call that Detective Torres had been dreading. David Caldwell, now 47 and serving as a lieutenant with the Milwaukee Police Department, had never stopped hoping that his sister's case would be solved. When Torres called to inform him about the discovery of Maggie's satchel and notebook, the emotion in David's voice was palpable, even over the phone. "You found her notebook?" David's voice cracked slightly. "The one she always carried with her?" "Yea." Torres explained the circumstances of the discovery, carefully reading selected passages from the notebook that detailed Maggie's growing fears in the weeks before she vanished. David listened in silence, and when Torres finished, there was a long pause before he spoke again. "She never told me about any of this," David said finally. "The stalking, the phone calls, feeling like someone had been in her apartment. Why didn't she call me? I was a cop. I could have helped her." It was a question that would haunt David Caldwell as he drove down from Milwaukee that afternoon to meet with Torres and review the evidence. The two men sat in a conference room at the Chicago Police Department. Maggie's notebook spread open between them, trying to understand why she had chosen to document her fears rather than seek help from her family or the authorities. "She was always independent," David explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Even as a kid, she wanted to handle things herself. She probably thought she was being paranoid or that we'd worry too much and tried to convince her to move back home." Torres nodded, understanding the psychology. Many victims of stalking initially dismiss their own instincts, especially when the harassment is subtle and could be explained away as coincidence. Maggie's notebook entries showed a woman trying to rationalize increasingly disturbing events, hoping they would simply stop if she ignored them. The reinvestigation began with a thorough examination of the Riverside Community Center and its history. Torres discovered that in 1988 the building had been operating as a youth center, offering after-school programs and evening activities for teenagers from the surrounding neighborhoods. The facility had been managed by the city's Parks and Recreation Department, with a small staff of full-time employees and numerous volunteers. What made the location particularly interesting was its connection to Lincoln Elementary School. Several programs at the community center had been designed to serve students from Lincoln and other nearby schools, including tutoring sessions and recreational activities. It was entirely possible that Maggie had been familiar with the building and its staff, though there was no record of her having visited there in an official capacity. Torres obtained the employment records for everyone who had worked at the community center in 1988, as well as lists of regular volunteers and program participants. It was painstaking work, made more difficult by the fact that many of the records had been stored in various city offices over the years, and some had been lost or destroyed according to standard document retention policies. One name that appeared repeatedly in the records was Robert Henley, who had worked as the evening custodian from 1987 through 1989. Henley had been responsible for locking up the building each night and had possessed keys to all areas, including the basement storage rooms where the satchel had been discovered. More intriguingly, Torres discovered that Henley had been terminated from his position in November 1988, just weeks after Maggie's disappearance, for what the records described as failure to follow established security procedures. When Torres tried to locate Henley for questioning, he discovered that the man had died in 1995 from complications related to alcoholism. However, Henley's former supervisor, Ana Rodriguez, was still alive and living in Chicago. Now in her 70s and retired, Rodriguez remembered both Henley and the circumstances of his termination clearly. Bob was a strange man, Rodriguez told Torres during their interview at her home in Pilsen. He'd been doing the job for over a year, and at first he seemed fine, quiet, kept to himself, always showed up on time. But in the fall of 1988, his behavior started changing. He became paranoid, I guess you'd call it. Started talking about people following him, said he thought his phone was being tapped. Torres felt a chill as Rodriguez continued her description. The parallels to Maggie's notebook entries were unmistakable. The final straw came in early November, Rodriguez continued. We had a surprise inspection of the facility, and we found that Bob had been sleeping in the building overnight. He'd set up a kind of camp in the basement, with blankets and food and personal belongings. When we confronted him about it, he became agitated and claimed he wasn't safe at his own apartment. We had to let him go. We couldn't have an employee living in a city facility without authorization. Rodriguez's description of Henley's makeshift living space in the basement lined up perfectly with the location where Maggie's satchel had been found. Torres theorized that Henley had hidden the bag among his personal belongings, and when he'd been forced to leave quickly after his termination, he'd simply abandoned it, along with other items he couldn't carry. But this raised the crucial question. How had Robert Henley come to possess Margaret Caldwell's satchel in the first place? Further investigation into Henley's background revealed a man with a history of mental illness and obsessive behavior. He had been arrested twice in the 1980s for harassment and stalking, though both cases had been dismissed when the victims failed to pursue prosecution. His former landlord remembered him as a tenant who frequently complained about being watched and followed, and who had installed multiple locks on his apartment door. Torres began to construct a theory. Robert Henley had become obsessed with Margaret Caldwell, perhaps after seeing her in the neighborhood or learning about her through some connection to the community center. His mental state had been deteriorating throughout 1988. Manifesting in the same kind of paranoid behavior that he would later project onto others. He had stalked Maggie for weeks, making the phone calls and following her home from school until finally confronting her on that October evening. But where was Maggie herself? If Henley had taken her, what had he done with her? And why had he kept her satchel hidden in the community center basement instead of disposing of it entirely? The answer to these questions would require Torres to dig deeper into Robert Henley's life and activities in the months following Maggie's disappearance. What he discovered would paint a picture of a deeply disturbed individual whose obsession with a young teacher had led to consequences that reached far beyond a single October night in 1988. Torres's investigation into Robert Henley's movements after Margaret Caldwell's disappearance revealed a man whose life had spiraled completely out of control. After losing his job at the community center, Henley had become increasingly erratic and paranoid. His landlord at the time, Mrs. Florence Kowalski, Coincidentally, the wife of Pete Kowalski, the superintendent of Maggie's apartment building, remembered Henley as a tenant who had stopped paying rent and had essentially disappeared sometime in December 1988. "He just vanished one day," Mrs. Kowalski told Torres during their interview. "Left all his stuff behind, furniture, clothes, everything. We had to get a court order to clean out the apartment and re-rent it. When we went through his belongings, we found boxes and boxes of newspaper clippings, all about missing persons cases and unsolved crimes. It was disturbing." Torres asked what had happened to Henley's belongings, hoping that some evidence might still exist after all these years. Mrs. Kowalski explained that most items had been donated to charity, but she had kept a few boxes in her basement, thinking that Henley might eventually return to claim them. "I know it sounds foolish," she said, "but I felt sorry for him. He was clearly ill, and I kept thinking his family might come looking for his things someday." The boxes in Mrs. Kowalski's basement proved to be a treasure trove of disturbing evidence. Torres found detailed maps of Lincoln Park with various routes marked in red ink, photographs taken from a distance of women walking alone, and a journal filled with rambling entries about surveillance techniques and target acquisition. Most chilling of all was a section devoted entirely to Margaret Caldwell, containing her school photo cut from a newspaper article, her address written in Henley's distinctive handwriting, and a detailed schedule of her daily routine. One entry, dated October 20th, 1988, read, "Subject maintains consistent pattern. Leaves school building 4:45, 5 p.m. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Takes same route home unless weather is severe. Lives alone. Minimal social contact during weekdays. Evening lights suggest she retires early, usually by 10 p.m. Opportunity window exists during walk home, particularly on Halsted Street between park and apartment building." Torres felt sick as he read Henley's clinical analysis of Maggie's routine. This wasn't random violence or a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned abduction by someone who had been studying his victim for weeks or possibly months. But the journal entries stopped abruptly on October 27th, 1988, the day before Maggie disappeared. After that, there were only blank pages, as if Henley had stopped writing once he'd acted on his obsession. The discovery of Henley's journal provided crucial evidence that he had indeed been stalking Margaret Caldwell, but it still didn't answer the question of what had happened to her. Torres expanded his investigation to include Henley's known associates and any properties he might have had access to in late 1988. Through Department of Motor Vehicles records, Torres discovered that Henley had owned a 1983 dark blue Buick sedan, a vehicle that matched several witness descriptions from the night of Maggie's disappearance. The car had been abandoned in a parking lot near O'Hare Airport in January 1989 and had eventually been towed and scrapped when Henley failed to claim it. Torres also learned that Henley had a brother, James, who lived in rural Wisconsin, about 2 hours north of Chicago. James Henley had owned a small farm with several outbuildings, and Robert had reportedly spent time there during his increasingly unstable final months in Chicago. When Torres contacted the Walworth County Sheriff's Department in Wisconsin, he spoke with Sheriff Linda Patterson, who remembered the Henley property well. In 1989, James Henley had been arrested for manufacturing methamphetamine in one of his outbuildings. During the investigation, police had discovered that Robert Henley had been living on the property intermittently, staying in a converted barn that James had fitted with basic living amenities. The whole setup was suspicious, Sheriff Patterson told Torres. James claimed he didn't know what his brother was doing there, said Robert, just showed up one day in late 1988 and asked to stay for a while. But we found evidence that Robert had been living there for months and that he'd been extremely paranoid about law enforcement and strangers coming onto the property. What was most significant about Sheriff Patterson's recollection was her description of Robert Henley's behavior during questioning. He kept talking about having disposed of a problem in Chicago, she said, At the time, we thought he was referring to drugs or some kind of business dispute, but he was very agitated about the possibility of police searching the property, kept insisting that we wouldn't find anything because he'd been very careful about cleanup. Torres asked whether the property had ever been thoroughly searched for evidence of violent crime. Sheriff Patterson admitted that their investigation had focused on the drug manufacturing operation and that the property's remote location and numerous outbuildings would have made a comprehensive search extremely difficult without specific reason to believe a crime had been committed there. If we'd known then that Robert Henley was connected to a missing person case in Chicago, Patterson said, we would have approached the investigation very differently. The Henley farm property had changed hands several times since James Henley's arrest and conviction. Torres tracked down the current owner, a young couple named Marcus and Jennifer Walsh, who had purchased the land in 1998 with plans to restore the farmhouse and operate a small organic farm. When Torres contacted the Walshes to ask about any unusual discoveries they might have made during their renovations, Jennifer's response sent a chill down his spine. Actually, she said slowly, there is something we found that always bothered us. When we were clearing out the old barn in 1999, we discovered what looked like a grave marker behind the building. It was just a simple wooden cross, very weathered, with no name or dates. We assumed it was for a pet or farm animal that had been buried there, but we never actually investigated what was underneath it. Torres asked the Walshes if they would consent to a search of their property, explaining that it might be connected to a missing person case from Chicago. The couple immediately agreed, and arrangements were made for a joint operation between the Chicago Police Department and the Walworth County Sheriff's Office. On a crisp morning in late April 2001, Detective Torres stood in a field behind the converted barn on what had once been the Henley farm. Ground-penetrating radar equipment had confirmed the presence of an anomaly beneath the weathered wooden cross that the Walshes had discovered years earlier. Now, as investigators carefully excavated the site, Torres couldn't shake the feeling that they were finally about to learn the truth about what had happened to Margaret Caldwell on that October night 13 years ago. The excavation was methodical and respectful, conducted by trained forensic technicians who understood the importance of preserving any evidence that might be found. As the morning progressed and the hole grew deeper, Torres found himself thinking about David Caldwell, who was driving up from Milwaukee to be present for whatever they might discover. He thought about Maggie's parents, now in their 70s, who had never stopped hoping their daughter might someday come home. At 11:47 a.m., one of the technicians called for Torres to come closer. At a depth of approximately 4 feet, they had uncovered what appeared to be fragments of cloth and other materials consistent with human burial. The wooden cross had indeed marked a grave, and while formal identification would require extensive forensic analysis, the location and circumstances strongly suggested that they had found the final resting place of Margaret Caldwell. As the excavation continued, investigators uncovered personal items that would later be confirmed as belonging to Maggie, a wristwatch that matched the description of the Timex her father had given her, small pieces of jewelry, and fragments of clothing consistent with what she had been wearing when she disappeared. Most significantly, they found her school identification badge, still bearing her photograph and name despite 13 years in the ground. The discovery brought closure to one of Chicago's longest-standing missing person cases, but it also raised new questions about Robert Henley and the extent of his crimes. Torres suspected that Maggie might not have been Henley's only victim, and that the paranoid, obsessive behavior documented in his journals might have led to other acts of violence that had never been connected or solved. As news of the discovery spread, other families of missing persons began to come forward, wondering if their own loved ones might have fallen victim to the same disturbed individual. The investigation into Robert Henley's activities would continue for months, eventually linking him to at least two other disappearances from the late 1980s and establishing him as one of Chicago's most prolific, undetected serial killers. But for David Caldwell, standing in that Wisconsin field as his sister's remains were carefully recovered by forensic technicians, the most important question had finally been answered. Margaret Caldwell had not simply vanished into the October night. She had been murdered by a man whose obsession had turned deadly, and her family could finally begin the process of laying her to rest. The notebook that had started it all, found wedged between floor joists in an abandoned building, had kept its secrets for 13 years before finally revealing the truth about what had happened to a dedicated teacher who had simply wanted to make it home safely from work. In the end, Maggie's own words had solved the mystery of her disappearance and brought her killer to justice, even though that justice had come far too late for the woman who had touched so many lives during her brief time on Earth. The funeral of Margaret Caldwell took place on a sunny Saturday morning in May 2001, 13 years after her disappearance. The service was held at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Rockford, the same church where Maggie had been baptized as an infant and confirmed as a teenager. Despite the passage of time, the pews were filled with people whose lives she had touched. Former students who were now adults, colleagues from Lincoln Elementary, neighbors from her Chicago apartment building, and dozens of others who had never forgotten the kind teacher who had simply vanished one October evening. David Caldwell delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He spoke of his sister's dedication to her students, her love of learning, and her unwavering belief that education could change lives. He talked about her dreams of someday becoming a principal, of the lesson plans they had found in her apartment that showed she was always thinking ahead, always planning new ways to engage and inspire her second graders. Maggie always said that teaching wasn't just a job for her, it was a calling, David said, looking out at the assembled mourners. She believed that every child deserved to feel safe and valued and capable of achieving great things. Today, as we finally lay her to rest, I want us to remember not just how she died, but how she lived, with purpose, with compassion, and with an unshakable faith in the potential of every person she met. Among those in attendance was Detective Torres, who had worked tirelessly to solve the case that had haunted the Chicago Police Department for over a decade. Also present were Jessica Park, the young construction worker whose curiosity about a leather satchel had ultimately led to the breakthrough in the investigation, and several members of the forensic team who had carefully excavated Maggie's remains from the Wisconsin farm. The discovery of Margaret Caldwell's notebook had indeed opened a window into the mind of a killer, but it had also revealed the courage of a woman who had tried to document her fears, even as she hoped they were unfounded. In her final weeks, Maggie had shown the same careful attention to detail that had made her an excellent teacher, recording observations and patterns that would ultimately help investigators understand what had happened to her. The investigation into Robert Henley's other crimes continued for months after Maggie's funeral. Using the techniques and patterns documented in his journal, investigators were able to connect him to the disappearances of Linda Morrison, a 28-year-old nurse who had vanished in 1987, and Patricia Chen, a 31-year-old social worker who had disappeared in early 1989. Both women had been stalked in a manner similar to Maggie, and both had been reported missing after failing to return home from work. The bodies of Morrison and Chen were eventually discovered in remote locations in Wisconsin and northern Illinois, buried in graves similar to the one where Maggie had been found. Like Maggie, both women had been described by friends and family as independent, caring professionals who were dedicated to helping others. Henley appeared to have targeted women who lived alone and followed predictable routines, studying them carefully before acting on his violent obsessions. The full extent of Henley's crimes might never be known. His journals contained references to other subjects and potential targets that investigators were never able to identify definitively. Some cases from the late 1980s that had previously been classified as missing persons were reopened and examined for possible connections to Henley, though the passage of time and the killer's death in 1995 made definitive conclusions difficult in many instances. What became clear was that Robert Henley had been a predator whose mental illness had manifested in an obsession with surveillance and control. His background revealed a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior that had been overlooked or inadequately addressed by the mental health and criminal justice systems of the time. Had he received proper treatment for his psychological issues, or had his earlier stalking arrests been prosecuted more aggressively, it's possible that Margaret Caldwell and his other victims might still be alive today. The case also highlighted the importance of trusting one's instincts about personal safety. Maggie's notebook entries showed that she had been acutely aware of the danger she was in, but like many victims of stalking, she had initially dismissed her fears as paranoia or overreaction. Her decision to document her concerns, while not enough to save her life, had ultimately provided the evidence needed to bring her killer to justice and prevent him from claiming additional victims. In the years following the resolution of the Caldwell case, Detective Torres became an advocate for better training and resources for investigating stalking and harassment complaints. He frequently spoke at law enforcement conferences about the importance of taking such reports seriously, even when the evidence seemed minimal or the victims seemed uncertain about the threat they were facing. Margaret Caldwell's notebook taught us that victims often know more than they think they know, Torres would tell audiences of police officers and prosecutors. Their instincts are telling them something is wrong, but they don't always trust those instincts or know how to articulate what they're experiencing. Our job is to listen, to take their concerns seriously, and to investigate thoroughly, even when the case seems like it might not lead anywhere. The Lincoln Elementary School established the Margaret Caldwell Memorial Library in her honor, funded by donations from former students, colleagues, and community members who wanted to ensure that her love of learning would continue to inspire future generations. The library featured a reading corner with comfortable chairs and good lighting, the kind of space where Maggie might have worked with struggling students or shared her favorite books with children who were just discovering the joy of reading. Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, David Caldwell would visit the Memorial Library to read to the second-grade classes, the same age group his sister had taught with such dedication. He would choose books that emphasized kindness, courage, and the importance of looking out for one another, values that Maggie had embodied throughout her life and work. The building that had once housed the Riverside Community Center, where Maggie's satchel had been hidden for 13 years, was successfully converted into affordable housing units as originally planned. A small plaque near the entrance commemorated the discovery that had finally brought closure to her family, though most residents were unaware of the building's connection to one of Chicago's most enduring missing person cases. Jessica Park, the young woman whose curiosity had led to the breakthrough in the investigation, was inspired by her role in solving the case to pursue a career in law enforcement. She eventually became a detective herself, specializing in cold cases and often crediting her involvement in the Caldwell investigation as the moment she realized she wanted to help families find answers about their missing loved ones. The story of Margaret Caldwell's disappearance and the eventual discovery of her remains became a case study in police academies and criminology programs across the country. It demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, the value of re-examining cold cases with fresh eyes and new technology, and the critical role that seemingly unrelated discoveries could play in solving decades-old mysteries. But perhaps most importantly, it served as a reminder that behind every missing person case is a human being with dreams, relationships, and a life that mattered to those who knew and loved them. Margaret Caldwell had been more than just a victim. She had been a daughter, a sister, a teacher, and a friend whose impact on the world extended far beyond the tragic circumstances of her death. In the end, the notebook that Maggie had kept during her final weeks had done exactly what she had hoped it would do. It had provided a record of what led up to her disappearance, and it had ultimately helped ensure that her killer could not harm anyone else. Even in death, Margaret Caldwell had protected others, just as she had protected and nurtured her students during her life as an educator. The case was officially closed in December 2001, but its impact would be felt for years to come in the improved procedures for investigating stalking cases, the advanced techniques for preserving and analyzing evidence, and the renewed commitment to never giving up on the victims whose voices had been silenced, but whose stories still demanded to be told.